I was 23 years old. I was standing in my own kitchen, in the house I had kept since I was 19, in the community I had been born inside of, and I had just said something true. Not something cruel, not something angry, not something that would have raised an eyebrow in any other world, just the truth. Plain and quiet and terrible, in the way that only the truth can be terrible when it lands inside a room that was built to keep it out. Eli didn't move for a long moment. He stood at the table with his hands at his sides, and he looked at me the way you look at something you thought you understood completely and have just discovered you don't understand at all. And then he turned and walked out of the kitchen without saying a single word. The back door opened, the back door closed, and I stood there in the silence he had left behind, and I felt, for the first time in my life, the exact weight of what I had just done. I did not know yet what it would cost me. I did not know yet that what happened next would stretch across 4 years of my life, like a winter that forgot to end. But I think, somewhere underneath the fear and the confusion and the beginning of a grief I couldn't name yet, some part of me already knew. Because I had watched it happen to other women. I had watched from the edges of quilting circles and barn raisings and church benches, the slow and quiet way a community can turn its face away from a woman who has said the wrong thing. I had watched it, and I had told myself that I would never be that woman. And now I was standing in my kitchen with a candle burning low and the truth still in the air around me, and I was already becoming her. Before I tell you what I said that night and what it set in motion, let me tell you who I was before it. Because you need to understand what I was made of before you can understand what it cost to break. If you have ever been punished for telling the truth inside a place that called itself love, I want you to stay with me through this one. My name is Clara, and this is Amish Clara, the space where the stories that were never meant to leave the community finally find their way into the open air. Subscribe if you want to keep hearing them. And tell me in the comments, was there ever a truth you swallowed because you were too afraid of what would happen if you let it out? My mother was the quietest woman I have ever known, and I grew up believing that her quietness was a kind of grace. She moved through our home the way water moves through a familiar landscape, around and over and past everything, finding the path of least resistance not because she was weak, but because that was what the land required of her. I never once heard her disagree with my father at the supper table. I never once heard her say, "I think differently." When my father made a decision, my mother made peace with it. That was simply the shape of things, the way weather was the shape of the sky, and no one thought to question it because questioning the sky is not something people do. I understood very early, though no one sat me down and explained it, that there was a kind of wife my community valued above all others. She was not a silent woman exactly. She could laugh, she could talk. She could have opinions about recipes, and which neighbor's garden had come in well, and how to handle a child's cough in winter. But there were rooms inside a marriage that she did not enter. There were conversations she did not begin. There were truths, specifically the kind of truths that made a husband uncomfortable or a household difficult or a bishop necessary, that she kept folded up inside herself the way you fold a letter you have written and decided not to send. This was not called silence in our community. It was called wisdom. It was called being a steady wife. It was called, most often, simply being good. I married Eli Brenneman in the April of my 19th year. He was 25, the oldest son of a family who had farmed the same land for 3 generations, and he had the particular steadiness that comes from men who have grown up knowing exactly who they are supposed to become. He was not unkind. I want to be clear about that, because the story I am telling you is not a simple one, and Eli was not a simple villain. He was a man who had been given a very specific set of instructions about what a husband was and what a wife was, and he followed those instructions the way a careful man follows a map he trusts completely, never thinking to look up and see whether the road itself is still the right one. The first years of our marriage, I held the silence perfectly. I kept his house the way my mother had kept my father's house. I rose before the children and went to bed after them. I planted and preserved and mended and managed, and I smoothed the edges of every difficult day before Eli came in from the barn, so that what he walked into was always peace, always order, always the quiet house of a woman who had handled everything and was not going to trouble him with how. I was praised for this, by his mother, by the women at church, by my own mother, who watched me settling into my marriage the way she had settled into hers, and seemed to find in that something that looked like relief. I was good at being good. And for a long time, being good felt like being safe. What broke first was small. Embarrassingly small, the way the first crack in a wall is always smaller than what eventually comes through it. There had been a decision made, a community decision, something that directly touched our lives and that I had a clear, reasoned, considered thought about. I had held that thought for several days, turned it over quietly, looked at it from every angle I had been given, and concluded, plainly and without drama, that the decision was wrong. And one evening at the kitchen table, in the ordinary light of an ordinary evening, I said so. Not loudly, not with anger, just clearly, the way you state a fact you believe to be true. Eli, I think this is wrong. I think there is a better way to handle it, and I think we should say so. The candle pulled inward. The room held its shape. And Eli, my husband of 4 years, the father of my 2 children, the steady and careful man who had never once raised his voice to me, looked at me across the table as though I had just spoken to him in a language he did not know I was capable of speaking. Then he stood up. Then he walked out. Then the back door closed. And the silence began. I did not understand at first what kind of silence it was going to be. In the early days after that evening, I told myself it was simply the silence of a man who needed time to think. Eli had always been slow with his responses, deliberate, not given to quick reactions, and I had come to read that slowness as thoughtfulness rather than anything more troubling. So I waited. I kept the house. I fed the children. I put supper on the table and cleared it away again, and I waited for him to come back to the conversation the way I thought reasonable people came back to conversations, ready to continue. He did not come back to it. What he did instead was something I had no word for then, and only found words for much later, in a different life, sitting across from a woman with a notepad who listened to me describe it and wrote something down and then said, quietly, "That has a name." What Eli did was remove himself from me while remaining entirely present. He was in the house, at the table, in the barn, in the bed. He spoke to the children with the same measured patience he always had. He managed the farm with the same quiet competence. He simply ceased to address me. Not in anger, not with visible contempt, but with a kind of practiced and deliberate blankness, as though I had become slightly transparent, as though the part of him that acknowledged my existence had made a decision to wait until I became worth acknowledging again. On the 4th day, his mother came. Miriam Brenneman was a woman who had raised 6 children and buried 1 and kept her household through 3 hard winters that had taken other families under, and she wore all of that in the particular set of her shoulders and the unhurried way she moved through a room as though she had already accounted for every possible difficulty it might contain. She came with a pie. She sat at my table. She talked about her garden and about a grandchild who had recovered from a fever and about the upcoming community work day. And she poured her own coffee and she refilled mine without being asked, and she did all of this with such warmth and such apparent ease that for a few minutes I allowed myself to believe she had simply come to visit. Then she set down her cup and she looked at me directly, and she said, "Clara, a wife's voice is a gift. But like all gifts, it can be given at the wrong time, in the wrong room, to the wrong ears. And when that happens, the gift becomes a burden for everyone who has to carry it." She paused. She smoothed the tablecloth with one hand, a small and careful gesture, like someone smoothing something that should not have gotten wrinkled. She said, "Eli is a good man. He only wants what any good man wants, a home that is steady, a wife who walks beside him, not ahead of him." She picked up her cup again. She did not look at me again after that. She finished her coffee, she complimented my pie safe, and she left. 3 days after Miriam, the deacon's wife came. 2 days after that, my own mother came. Each of them brought something warm and left something sharp. Each of them found a different way to hand me the same message, wrapped in a different cloth, delivered in a different gentle voice, but underneath always the same thing, always the same single clear instruction. Be smaller, Clara. Be quieter. Go back to what you were before that evening. The door is still open, but it will not stay open forever. And I felt it happening inside me, the thing they were trying to accomplish. I felt my own certainty beginning to dissolve at the edges, not because I had become convinced they were right, but because the pressure of so many quiet, certain women telling you that you are wrong does something to the architecture of your own mind. You begin to examine your memory. You begin to wonder if perhaps the words you said were harsher than you remember, or the moment worse chosen than you thought, or the truth you stated not quite as true as it felt at the time. You begin, slowly and almost without noticing, to rewrite yourself into the wrong. There was one night, 6 weeks after the evening at the kitchen table, when I almost went to Eli and surrendered. I had put the children to bed and I stood in the hallway outside our bedroom door with my hand raised, and everything inside me was so exhausted, so worn through by the cold and the quiet and the accumulated weight of all those careful women with their warm pies and their sharp underneath things, that I wanted nothing in the world more than to open that door and say, "I was wrong, I was foolish, forgive me. Let the warmth come back." I stood there for what felt like a very long time. And then something so small I could not name it, some thread of the thing I had been before that evening, held. I lowered my hand. I went back to the kitchen. I sat at the table in the dark for an hour, and I did not cry because I was too tired even for that. But I did not go through the door. I did not understand then what I had just done. I did not know that not going through that door was the most important thing I had ever done in my life. The community withdrawal deepened through the following months like a tide going steadily out. The church pew where I usually sat filled up around me, and then subtly didn't. Invitations to workdays and quilting gatherings came later, then less frequently, then not at all. The women I had known since childhood smiled at me on the street with a particular smile, the kind that closes a face rather than opening it. My children, who were 5 and 3 and too young to understand what was happening, came home from their afternoons with neighbor children with something careful in their faces, some slight learned guardedness that they had not had before, and which broke something in me that I did not have the language yet to describe. It was in the second year of the silence that an older woman named Ruth stopped me. Not family, not close. She was a woman from the far edge of our district whom I knew mostly by sight and by the particular way she moved through a community gathering, slightly apart from the main clusters of women, like someone who had long ago made a separate peace with belonging. She stopped me on a dirt road between 2 fields on an ordinary Thursday, in the middle of a walk I took alone sometimes to remember what my own company felt like. She did not warn me. She did not bring softness or sharpness or any of the things the other women had brought. She simply stopped walking and looked at me and asked me one question. "Clara," she said, "do you believe you were wrong?" No one had asked me that. In 2 years of women arriving with pies and words arranged like furniture to block a door, not one of them had asked me what I actually believed. The question landed somewhere so deep inside me that I felt it before I understood it. I opened my mouth. I closed it again. I stood on that dirt road between those 2 fields with the wind moving across the top of the grass, and I could not answer. Not because I didn't know. I knew. I had always known. But saying it out loud to another person in the plain air of a real afternoon would make it a different kind of real. It would mean I had been right for 2 years while being treated as though I were wrong. And if that was true, then all of it, the silence, the cold, the careful women, the pew that filled around me, all of it would need to be looked at in a completely different light. And I was not sure I was ready for what that light would show me. Ruth did not push me to answer. She just looked at me for one long moment, with the eyes of a woman who has already had the conversation with herself that I was not yet able to finish. Then she said simply, "When you know what you believe, you will know what to do." She nodded once, the way very certain people nod, as though something has been confirmed rather than begun, and she walked on. And I stood there on the road and I watched her go, and I felt something in me that had been very tightly closed begin, slowly and almost painfully, to open. I stayed 2 more years after that road. I want to be honest about that, because I think the people who need this story most are the ones who stayed longer than they thought they should have, and I do not want them to feel alone in that. I stayed because I had children, and the children were inside the community, and taking them out of the only world they had ever known felt like a violence I wasn't sure I had the right to commit. I stayed because I had no money of my own, and no work history, and no last name in the outside world that meant anything. I stayed because leaving meant shunning, and shunning meant losing everyone, and everyone was all I had ever had. But I was no longer performing the silence the same way. The difference was invisible from the outside. I kept the house. I came to church. I smiled the right smiles, but inside the silence now I was building something. Slowly, quietly, the way Amish women build everything, without announcing it, without asking permission, one small, careful piece at a time. I was building the version of myself that would eventually be able to walk out the door. The morning I left was not dramatic. It was a Tuesday in November, gray and flat and cold in the way that Ohio November mornings are cold, as though the sky has made a decision and is not interested in discussing it. The children were with me. I had one bag for each of us. I had the address of a woman who helped people leave, written on a piece of paper I had carried folded inside my shoe for 6 months, because it was the only place I was certain it would never be found. I walked out the back door of the house I had kept for 6 years, and I did not look back at it, not because I was strong, but because I knew that if I looked back I would not be able to keep walking, and I had to keep walking. The shunning arrived exactly as I had known it would, exactly as every woman in that community knew it would, like a winter storm whose shape you can read in the clouds days before it arrives. My family's letters came back to me unopened. The people I had known since birth looked past me in the streets of the nearest town, as though I had become the kind of thing that happens to other people. And it hurt, God, it hurt in ways I am still learning to describe, because there is no grief quite like the grief of being erased by the people who taught you your own name. But outside, in the strange new country of the ordinary world, I found a therapist, a quiet woman with a notepad and a particular patience. And in her office slowly, one word at a time, I began to find the language for what had happened to me. Coercive control. Social isolation as punishment. Manufactured consent, the kind that looks like agreement but is built entirely from the removal of every alternative. She gave me these words carefully, the way you hand something fragile to someone whose hands are still learning how to hold things, and each word landed in me like a light being turned on in a room I had been navigating in the dark for years. In my community, none of these words had existed. What was done to me after that evening in the kitchen had no name in Pennsylvania Dutch. We called the silence a husband's disappointment. We called the women's visits concern. We called the pew that filled around me the natural order of a community that knew its own values. We called the whole long cost of my one true sentence simply the consequences of pride. We did not have a word for what it actually was. So it continued, generation after generation, kitchen after kitchen, wife after wife, in the way that things without names always continue, invisibly, unremarkably, dressed in the ordinary clothes of just how things are. I think about Ruth sometimes, the woman on the road who asked me the only question that mattered. She is still inside the community as far as I know, still moving through gatherings with that particular slightly apart quality, like someone who has made a separate peace with belonging. I think about what it cost her to ask me that question, knowing what she knew about what questions cost. I think about how many women she has stopped on how many roads, and how many of them have eventually walked out a door they spent years building toward. I am sitting here today because she asked me what I believed. I am speaking today because a community of people spent 4 years trying to teach me that my speaking was a problem to be corrected. I want to say something directly to you now, whoever you are, wherever you are listening from. If you have ever said a true thing and been made to pay for it in the slow, quiet way that true things are paid for in closed communities, I see you. If you have ever stood in a hallway with your hand raised and almost surrendered not because you were wrong, but because being right had become unbearable, I see you. If you have ever had your certainty dissolved not by evidence but by the steady accumulated pressure of people who needed you to be uncertain, I see you. You were not too loud. You were not prideful. You were not a bad wife, or a bad daughter, or a bad member of anything. You said a true thing. And the most dangerous thing you can do inside a system built on silence is say a true thing clearly. Your voice was never the problem. It was always the proof that the system had one. If this found you at the right moment, please leave me a comment below. Tell me if you have ever had a truth taken from you and given back as something to be ashamed of. Tell me if you found your way out, or if you are still finding it. Tell me if there was ever a Ruth on a road for you. I read every word. And if you want to keep hearing the stories that were never supposed to leave these communities, subscribe to Amish Clara. There is so much still waiting to be said. Until next time, your truth is not a burden. It never was. It was the most important thing about you. They just needed you to believe otherwise.